Welcome everybody to this webinar to launch Frontier Economics Business Case for a National Animal Welfare Commission. My name is Britta Jones and I'm Director of Strategy here at the Australian Alliance for Animals. I'm joined today by our presenters from Frontier Economics, Alexander Cifuentes and Sophia Collar. Welcome to you. And also by my co-founder and Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Alliance for Animals, Dr Jed Goodfellow. Welcome, Jed. We're really pleased that you're able to join us for this launch, which presents the economic case for what we see as a key reform for animal welfare governance in Australia, one that would lead to a fairer and more independent framework for animals. Before we begin, I'd like to recognise that we're all meeting on Aboriginal land and that everything we do here is building on over 65,000 years of continuous culture. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their enduring connections to land, sea and community, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. We also have some people to thank for being here and being able to present this report. The report was made possible excuse me, through contributions from several generous individuals and organisations. We're very grateful for the support of Angela Martin, the Humane World for Animals Australia, and Voiceless, the Animal Protection Institute. We're also especially grateful to the family of the late Monica Janinski, whose legacy funding was integral to commissioning this report. Monica was a dedicated supporter and volunteer with the Alliance. She was a committed advocate for institutional change for animals. Monica's kindness, concern, and her burning desire to help others, especially non-human animals, was apparent to everyone who met her. We miss her very much and would like to dedicate this report to her memory. So, what are we going to cover today? We've got a tight session here of 45 minutes. So after this quick introduction, we'll hear from Alexandra and Sophia, who'll present the findings of their report. Jed will then provide a brief response to these findings, and after that we'll have time for a few audience questions. So you can ask your questions via the webinar Q&A at any time during the presentations. Today's webinar builds on a proposal that's been gestating for many years. So 10 years ago, the Productivity Commission identified a major gap in Australia's animal welfare governance system and recommended the establishment of a National Animal Welfare Commission to provide independent leadership and improve the development of animal welfare policy. A decade later, we've taken the next step towards this reform to provide the economic evidence base for what we think is one of the most significant and important and necessary institutional reforms for animals in Australia. Frontier Economics report is the first independent economic assessment of the proposed National Commission model. So I'm very pleased to be able to hand over to Alex and Sophia to present their findings. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Sophia, are you able to share your slides?
Yes, thanks, Alex.
Great, thanks. So given we have limited time, I'm going to provide a very rapid overview of our involvement in this piece of work, and then I'm going to hand to Sophia, who will talk through the options that we tested and the results in a bit more detail, while making sure we have time for your burning questions at the end of the session. Can you jump to the next slide? I think we've kind of already, talked about what we're covering today. So just in terms of, I guess, the background to our involvement in the project, but I already touched on this to some extent, but just, I guess, to strengthen while we're really here talking about the introduction of a commission. I'm sure I don't need to tell the attendees, but since the 1980s, voluntary model codes of practice have guided industry practice in animal welfare management in Australia. And in 2004, following the introduction of the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy, the government set out to transition these model codes of practice into animal welfare standards and guidelines, comprising mandatory standards and best practice guidelines intended for adoption into state and territory legislation. However, as Bitter mentioned, in 2016, the Productivity Commission reviewed the regulation of animal welfare in Australia and found that the process for developing standards and guidelines has been too slow, has resulted in fragmented regulation across jurisdictions, may not be based on the most appropriate animal welfare science, and has the potential to create conflicts of interest. More than 2 decades later, only 6 standards and guidelines have been developed, and of the 6 standards developed, only one has been fully implemented into state, territory, and law. State and territory law. So why are we here from Frontier Economics? We've been assisting the Australian Alliance for Animals in developing a strategic business case for the establishment of a National Animal Welfare Commission. So that involved baseline analysis of the current arrangements for developing animal welfare standards and guidelines in Australia, a cost-benefit analysis which considered the economic, social, and environmental cost and benefits of the introduction of a commission compared to the current arrangements, and implementation considerations, including broader considerations of the scope, governance, and funding arrangements of the proposed commission. And our analysis was informed by stakeholder engagement with jurisdictional representatives and desktop research. So I'm going to hand over to Sophia, who's going to talk us through the options and then also the results.
Thanks, Alex. So I guess before we get into looking at the proposed design of the commission, just starting off with what the current arrangements are for developing and implementing animal welfare policy in Australia. So at the moment, animal welfare policy predominantly falls under the remit of states and territories, which review and develop standards and guidelines, and then implement legislation based on endorsed standards and guidelines. They also play a role in managing monitoring and enforcement, and the enforcement entities that sit within each of the states and territories. Within the federal government, there are a range of bodies that are also involved in animal welfare policy development, namely the Animal Welfare Task Group, which comprises jurisdictional representatives from the states and territories, which then elevates matters to the AGSOC and then to the AMM to finally get standards and guidelines endorsed. So I suppose kind of what we're predominantly talking about is this process for developing standards and guidelines, and I suppose how it can be improved. So currently what we see is that states and territories are responsible for identifying gaps or limitations in standards and guidelines. They then take this to the Animal Welfare Task Group, and then it's reliant on a jurisdiction to actually volunteer to lead the process to review and develop a set of standards and guidelines. And we see there's a lot of bottlenecks with waiting for a jurisdiction to raise their hand to volunteer to lead this process. The standards and guidelines are then developed with key stakeholder consultation with all of the jurisdictions and also key stakeholder consultations outside of government. And then the updated standards and guidelines, once they've been developed, are passed on to the AMM and to the AGSOC for endorsement. Once they've been endorsed, they are then published, and then it's up to states and territories to then implement the updated standards and guidelines into their jurisdictional law. So now that we've kind of covered what the current process is, what would it look like in the case of a commission? So we've based the design on the commission based on the Productivity Commission recommendations. And what they recommended is to have this body that sits within the federal government, which is predominantly responsible for reviewing and developing standards and guidelines. It would also be responsible for reviewing the implementation of standards and guidelines by jurisdictions, leading scientific research, and then some smaller roles associated with reviewing the regulation of live exports, which is DAF's responsibility, and also being the secretariat for the task group. So you'd still see state and territory departments being responsible for implementing legislation and managing monitoring and enforcement, but it would really be the commission who takes over the role of developing the standards and guidelines. As part of this, we would also see that the commission would develop what we call regulation-ready standards and guidelines. So a set of documents that states and territories can very easily reference in their legislation to prevent the administrative duplication of having them develop those standards and guidelines into their own legislation. So where do we see the benefits from the proposed commission arising? It's predominantly in the efficiency gains that result from centralizing these processes at a national level. So firstly, we see economies of learning from having this centralized at a national level. So as opposed to, I think at the moment, 4 different jurisdictions have put up their hand to lead the process of developing a set of standards or guidelines. And when you have this spread over different departments, you essentially lose the economies of learning that you'd get by centralizing it within one body. So the idea is this commission would repeatedly perform this activity, and as a result would refine their processes, improve the decision making, and learn from past mistakes to really streamline the process of developing these standards and guidelines. As part of this, we would also expect that they would retain specialist staff, develop enduring relationships with stakeholders and also technical experts, and establish standardized methodologies that would reduce the resource burden of developing these standards and guidelines. Also, as part of this, we would see that the standards and guidelines would be streamlined. So as I kind of discussed on the previous slide, they would be developed in a way that would be regulation ready to really reduce the burden on states and territories on implementing those into their own legislation. This would benefit states and territories by reducing their legislative drafting burden, but would also reduce the regulatory fragmentation across jurisdictions. So I guess before we jump into the cost benefit analysis, just an overview of how we've quantified costs and benefits of the commission. So really a cost benefit analysis requires you to establish a causal link between the option that you're considering and the costs and benefits that result. So the way we do this, and an example of one of the key costs and benefits, is this avoided administrative cost to states and territories. And so the idea is you identify the model, which is the commission, the input, which is establishing it as an independent national body, an output, which is that standards and guidelines are streamlined, and as a result, this results in an outcome, which is a cost saving for states and territories, which delivered as a community benefit. So on this slide, I've just got a little bit of an overview of the costs and benefits that we've considered in this analysis. So we've considered the upfront costs of changing legislation and establishing a new entity quantitatively, as well as the ongoing costs of the commission. We've also included the avoided costs to state and territory governments and also federal governments by implementing a commission that streamlines the process for developing the standards and guidelines. There's a range of benefits that we were not able to put a quantitative value on, and we've considered these qualitatively in the analysis. And there'll be a slide on that coming up. So jumping into the results, which is what everyone is keen to see. So as you can see, we expect that the commission would deliver a net present value benefit of 9.61 million with a BC benefit cost ratio of 1.3 approximately. So the costs are predominantly comprised of the upfront costs of changing the legislation to allow for a commission, and then also all the upfront costs of actually establishing the said commission. And then we would also see ongoing costs every year of actually operating the commission. And so we've considered these over a modelling period of 30 years. In terms of the benefits, we would see those predominantly arising from the avoided resource requirements to the federal and state and territory governments. And those are also avoided costs that are achieved over the 30-year modelling period that we've considered. So I suppose to break this down into, an annual figure, once the commission is in place, we would expect that approximately the annual operating costs per year on average are 2.4 million, but the annual cost savings to state, territory, and federal governments is 3.5 million. So that's a net approximate 1.1 million of benefit that would be delivered approximately every year. So to support the quantitative findings, we've also undertaken a qualitative analysis. And so as you can see, there are a range of qualitative costs and benefits that we've also considered that we expect to arise from the commission. I guess the key takeaway from this slide is that we expect majority of these benefits and that we could, majority of these impacts that we couldn't quantify to be benefits. And so in sum, we expect that the actual impact of the commission will have a greater benefit than we were able to quantify. I suppose just to kind of draw attention to kind of the key benefit key qualitative benefits. We do expect the Commission to deliver improved animal welfare outcomes because we're reducing the bottlenecks for developing standards and guidelines, which will hopefully mean that we will experience less delays in developing standards and guidelines. I know some have taken years and years to actually develop, and as a result, we don't actually see the benefits that they're supposed to create eventuate until years and years later. So that's, I suppose, a key qualitative benefit that we weren't able to value. So I suppose just some implementation considerations of the Commission. So we found that it's likely to deliver value. However, we've just undertaken a strategic business case. So for this to actually, for an investment to actually be considered, a full business case should be undertaken. And there's a few things that should be considered about the design of the Commission in undertaking a full business case. And so some of those things that we've identified just through some stakeholder engagement and also desktop research and engagement with the Alliance are these 4 features of the proposed Commission. So one of those things, the first feature would be the scope of the proposed Commission. If the Commission was to be implemented, we would have to consider what the scope of the Commission's activities would be, including the animals included in the remit of the Commission. Also the governance models, so the reporting lines, and especially the ministerial portfolio in which the Commission is going to be located. Another important consideration is the funding arrangement. So it could be valuable to consider a cost sharing structure of the proposed Commission, and a full financial analysis should be undertaken in order to support that funding arrangements analysis. And finally, the structure of the Commission, so how states and territories would be involved in the process of the Commission, and how key stakeholders should also be involved in how the Commission develops the standards and guidelines. So I think that's all from us. Quicker than we expected.
Thanks so much, Sophia, and to Alex. We'll hold off on questions until we've heard from Jed. So I'll just hand over to Jed just to talk about our response and some next steps.
Right, thanks very much, Bidder, and huge thanks to Sophia and Alex for all of their work in putting together this report over the last several months. It's been quite a significant undertaking, but reading through the report, which you should receive following this webinar, probably tomorrow, you'll see very clearly that it paints a picture of the current system fundamentally not working. So as we heard there from Sophia and Alex, over the last 2 decades, we've only had one standard and guideline fully implemented in all of the states and territories around the country. And it takes, on average, 9 years to review and then to implement each standard and guideline. And that's if they're actually implemented at the end of the day. When you look at the process of requiring individual states to volunteer to lead these national processes, we see that there are major bottlenecks there. The National Code of Practice for the Welfare of Pigs, for instance, has been on the Animal Welfare Task Group's work plan since 2016. So a decade of sitting on that work plan with no state or territory putting up their hand to lead that process. And you've got to ask the question about, can we blame them for that? Considering that the states and territories have no real legal compulsion to lead a national standards development process. Really, we need to have a central body at the national level that has the clear responsibility to undertake this process so that we can get through those bottlenecks and see some progress starting to happen. So, of course, we're now really seeing the evidence base being created around those reform proposals. As we heard, the Productivity Commission identified these issues 10 years ago, but it didn't put together the actual economic figures around what a national commission would cost and indeed what kinds of efficiencies it would bring to our current federal framework. So we're plugging that gap with Frontier's great work. But not only is this good policy in the Productivity Commission's view, but it's also popular policy as well. We have had successive community surveys and polling done by Behaviour Works Australia over the years, which has shown strong majority of support around the country for an independent and impartial body to be leading on national policy. And we also see that support going across geographical divides as well. There's commonly a misunderstanding or a claim that people in city and metro areas care more about animal welfare than people in regional rural areas of the country. That couldn't be further from the truth. And we see the data showing that indeed on some measures, people in regional and rural areas of Australia actually have stronger rates of support for these animal welfare reforms than for those in city and metro areas. But across the board, very strong majority support for these reforms. So yes, not only is it good policy, not only is it popular policy, but now we're also seeing that it makes economic sense as well. Indeed, this reform would be saving governments money and by virtue of that, saving taxpayers money, while at the same time removing unnecessary duplication, streamlining processes and improving animal welfare. So it really is, in our view, a no-brainer. It's a win-win outcome for governments, for industry and for the community as a whole, and of course for animals. So what are we doing now with this report and this data? So we're going to be very busy over the coming months, and indeed starting today, we'll be briefing our political and government stakeholders around the country. Bitter and I are off to the National Labor Party conference in Adelaide tomorrow, so we'll be talking with many people within the Labor Party there and socialising this concept and presenting the data that Frontier have put together to stakeholders there. But we'll be getting around to political parties of all stripes, and indeed investing a lot in briefings at the state and territory level as well, because of course this will require state and territory support for this model to get up. We already know that there's strong support for this within some state jurisdictions, including significant state jurisdictions, because they're frustrated that the national process is not working and they see the very real need for a more streamlined process and approach, and indeed support the federal government in leading that. So we'll be very busy with those stakeholder briefings. We'll also be feeding this data into the federal budget cycles as well. So at the end of the year, pre-budget submissions will open for the 27-28 federal budget cycle. So of course now we'll have a nice robust submission that we can be putting into that process, and we'll do that in successive budget cycles as well. And finally, of course, we'll be seeking commitments from political parties ahead of the next federal election in 2028. So I think we're just past the midterm point for the current government's term. And of course, we'll be bringing all of this data and this research and these policy proposals through to the current federal government. But we'll also be looking to the future, getting commitments from parties for this reform leading up to the next federal election as well. And there's certainly a role for you to play as well if you support these reforms in conveying your support to your local federal members of parliament, so that we can start to activate the community and ensure that members of parliament across the board see that A, there is a very real need for these reforms to happen, and B, there is a very good business case, an economic case, as well as a social case for why these reforms should take place as a matter of priority. So I will stop sharing there and hand back over to Bitter.
Thanks so much, Jed. We've got a little bit more time for questions than we thought we would have, so that's fantastic. So I'll just keep an eye on what's coming in on the Q&A. If you have got a question, you haven't asked it yet, please pop it in there. I'm going to start with a very general question. I think would probably go to you, Sophia, which is about how you actually calculate the cost of changing legislation, which was something that came up fairly early in your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry. So I realized I jumped through a lot of those costs and benefits that we quantified very quickly. But in terms of the upfront costs of changing legislation and then also of establishing an entity, Because we've only done a strategic business case, they're very specific costs that really depend on the sort of legislation you're writing and the sort of entity you're establishing. So it can be difficult to get a benchmark for those costs. So as a result, we've just used from our experience and with other entities, a kind of benchmark cost for legislation. And how much it should cost upfront for changing the legislation. I think it's in present value terms about 0.2 million. So compared to the other costs and benefits, it was quite minor. And I think in the report, when it's sent around, we have done some sensitivity testing around that assumption, just to test if it's a little bit higher, a little bit lower than what we've assumed, noting that it is an uncertain cost that we've included in the analysis.
And Sophia, it's correct to say, I guess, because you're talking about a net present value or a benefit to the community of around $10 million, even though there is that uncertainty around the cost, we have quite a large benefit range to play with. So even if the costs do increase, it's still likely that the Commission delivers value to the community.
Yeah, thank you. Another question about the costs is for the moderate cost that's assigned to the impact of increased compliant costs relating to improved animal welfare outcomes. What compliance activities is this referring to? Are you able to answer that one?
Yes, of course. So kind of as I noted with the qualitative costs and benefits, one of the key benefits that we couldn't value was the improved animal welfare outcomes. But of course, there's a trade-off with improving animal welfare outcomes. There can occasionally be additional costs to the agricultural industry. So an example is if there becomes, in standards and guidelines, there becomes rules about using pain relief, this might impose a cost on industry. And so it is important that we do consider this in the analysis, that does impose an additional cost. So that's what that cost is referring to.
Thank you. So another question is about why the Productivity Commission recommendation has sat there for 10 years, and it might be something that both you, Sophia, and Jed might want to answer. So there's obviously animal welfare and economic arguments for that recommendation. I'll go to you, Jed, first, but the question is also asking, is there a key window of influence or opportunity, for example, with upcoming elections, for trying to achieve this change?
Yeah, great question. So as you could see, the report was given to the previous coalition government back in 2017, I think, when it was sort of published. And at the time, we had Minister Barnaby Joyce in the role. So the coalition government did not support the idea of setting up a national commission, essentially along the lines of they framed it as being more bureaucratic red tape, essentially, without really looking further at the potential benefits that it would bring. So it's been kind of sitting there without a lot of attention. Of course, the Labor Party at the time was looking at a similar kind of model, an independent office of animal welfare, which eventually turned into the Inspector General of Animal Welfare, with a fairly limited role, which is just overseeing the Department of Agriculture's role in regulating live animal exports. There is scope, I think, for increasing the remit and the role of the Inspector General model, but to undertake the process of developing and reviewing national standards and guidelines, that's really the major problem with the current national framework, as we've discussed, that would require a different type of entity, like a commission, a policy standard setting specialist, essentially. And an Inspector General of Animal Welfare isn't really set up to perform that type of role. So it's been sitting there for the last 10 years, primarily because the coalition government didn't accept it at the time. The Labor government was focused on a slightly different model, but I think the case now for change and the evidence-based change is so great that the current Labor government will need to very much revisit this model, because there does need to be some kind of structural change to the way our national standards are reviewed and developed at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Jed. Sophia, or Alex, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I guess I just add, I guess business cases like these kind of business cases are the evidence that sometimes you need to get people to take that step. It's much harder, I guess, for things to sit on the shelf where you do have the hard kind of numbers that Treasury would speak, etc. So this should be a good step forward in terms of seeing action in that space. I guess I'd also say in the webinar chat, there's discussion about funding and the fact that it's a net cost to the federal government and a net benefit to the states. That's also a potential reason why it's been hard to get traction because there are so many different parties involved in the process and the funding arrangements aren't necessarily straightforward. Doesn't mean that it can't be overcome, but it just means it's another challenge that needs to be grappled with.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And just going back to the reference to the Inspector General, I mean, that's a part-time role. It's one person with, I think, one staff. There's that, the funding issue is really live in terms of there's very minimal funding at the moment for this type of approach. There's a question here, Jed, I think it's probably best answered by you. So the AJP, the Animal Justice Party, are asking for an independent Office of Animal Welfare. How does their proposal link with this?
Yeah, good question, because this concept of an independent Office of Animal Welfare has also been around for quite a long time. Indeed, it was the former member for Fremantle, Melissa Park, who first proposed an independent Office of Animal Welfare following the live export debate with the Four Corners program on the slaughter of Australian cattle in Indonesia, which of course set off a very big debate about potential conflicts of interest within the Federal Department of Agriculture, whether or not it was well suited to be regulating and leading on national animal welfare policy. So it depends upon the what functions and the role of the independent office. But really, if an independent Office of Animal Welfare was intended to also play a role in leading national policy development and standards development, then essentially it would be the same thing as we're proposing. It's just under a different name. We've adopted the name that the Productivity Commission has recommended, a National Commission of Animal Welfare, because that generally commissions are generally bodies that will undertake policy and standard setting roles. Yes, I mean, the proposals I've seen for an independent Office of Animal Welfare generally do also include policy and standard setting functions. So really, they're very related concepts. It's just more of a change in the title and description rather than the substantive functions of the body.
Yeah. Thank you. There's also a question about the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy, AWS, and how that sits within the structure of a National Animal Welfare Commission. And obviously, part of what AWS has done in the past is promote harmonisation of standards and guidelines. So yeah, just your thoughts on that.
Yes, and I should have addressed that in my overview. But yes, the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy is currently underdeveloped to be renewed by the federal government in concert with the states and territories. And indeed, it hopefully will be established next year. So we would certainly see a role for a national commission in really leading the implementation of that national strategy. It would really make sense for the National Commission with its expert staff. And as you'll see in the report, we're proposing, as the Productivity Commission proposed, that the Commission be staffed by 5 key expert-based commissioners supported by technical and support staff. So it would make a lot of sense to see the National Commission essentially leading the implementation of that strategy once it is developed. At the moment, it's sitting with the Department of Agriculture, but I think it would be more well placed to be led by a National Animal Welfare Commission.
Yeah, thanks, Jed. That's really good for clarification. Sophia and Alex, there's a question about whether the fact that this is a net cost, or it looks like it would be a net cost to the federal government and a net benefit to the states. And that's asking whether it might be possible to use cost sharing to make it a net benefit to both.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as we kind of discussed in the implementation considerations slide, that is something that more work should go into working out. So there's many options for how to fund such a body, and one of those is a cost sharing arrangement, which has, in my understanding, occurred for other bodies as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question, I think probably, yeah, Jed, I know that you'd have a response to this about international trade agreements. So have international trade agreements been factored into the approved animal welfare outcomes as a potential benefit? I know that's a benefit, like we see that very much within the Alliance as a benefit. So maybe you speak to that briefly and then I'll go over to Sophia.
Yes, absolutely. Australia is now signatory to 3 international trade agreements that include obligations relating to animal welfare. The EU Free Trade Agreement, the UK Free Trade Agreement, and the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with the UAE. So having a National Animal Welfare Commission that improves national consistency with our standards is certainly going to be of great benefit to demonstrating to those trading partners that are very sensitive to animal welfare that Australia does have a robust national system and a consistent national system for the production of agricultural goods that are being exported into those markets. So that's certainly an added benefit to a commission-based model, and I know Sophia has factored that into the qualitative analysis as well.
Yes, we have.
Great. Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions that are kind of asking about examples of similar independent commissions at a federal level. I think those relate to like either in other areas in Australia or potentially other models in other countries for a similar approach to this.
Yeah. Alex or Sophie, I know there was one in particular that was highlighted in the report that was quite relevant.
Yes, in the report we talk about the National Construction Code. Is that what you're referring to, Jed? Yeah.
Yes.
And so we would kind of envisage the commission operating, I suppose, sort of similarly, that it would develop these standards and guidelines, which can then be adopted by reference by states and territories. And that's exactly what's happened with this National Construction Code. It's developed by this independent kind of body, and then all the states and territories just refer back to it, and it really avoids that administrative duplication that we're seeing with animal welfare legislation at the moment.
Yeah, because one of the, I guess, hurdles or one of the areas for pushback that we often hear from the federal government and people within the Department of Agriculture is that they will say animal welfare is a state responsibility, therefore we don't have a role or it's not our primary role to be reviewing and developing these national standards, because at the end of the day, it's the states that are responsible for regulating it. But there are many different examples of where the federal government takes a leadership role in developing and producing national standards on issues that are regulated by states and territories. So there are several key models out there, and the National Building Code Authority or board is one of them, but it's really a function of the federal government to be improving that national consistency, even on matters that it doesn't necessarily have the regulatory responsibility for, because it's in the national interest to have that national consistency. And on a topic like animal welfare, we don't have differences of opinion between people in different states of the country around the importance of animal welfare. It seemed to be important throughout the country, and we have businesses that operate across state borders as well, so that national consistency is indeed in the national interest, and that's where the federal government has the key role to play in leading this process.
We've got a couple of questions about scope. So what is the scope of the proposed commission in terms of, will it just focus on farmed animals, or does it have a broader scope potentially for animals in research or companion animals or wildlife?
Is this one for us?
It's for both of you, I think. Yeah.
I can start with how we've considered it in the business case, and then maybe I'll pass over to Jed to talk a little bit about what it would look like. So in the business case, we've currently only looked at animals that are considered under the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy at the moment. So predominantly these are agricultural groups of animals, which is kind of the biggest sector that is developing the standards and guidelines for. However, as we touched on in the implementation consideration slide, there's definitely room to kind of consider change in scope depending on where it would be helpful.
Yeah. So I think the biggest need for reform is in the space of setting those national standards and guidelines for livestock in different agricultural industries. However, yes, as Sophia has outlined, in the National Animal Welfare Strategy, it includes 5 different sectors of animal use and interaction. So over time, yes, I think it would be desirable to see the Commission to have a remit that is consistent with the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy.
Thank you. We're getting close to end of times, but I think we've got time still for a couple more. One question here is about this kind of, I suppose, how agile a commission might be in terms of the development of standards and guidelines. So do you see them becoming easier to, I think this word isn't in the question, but develop, implement in the future with this structure? And would that mean that specific changes? So the example here is like introducing in vivo sexing for layer hen production, whether that would be something that would be able to happen more faster because of the structure. I'm going to go to Jed.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think that's a good one for Sophia and Alex, because in the report it does outline, and this was addressed in the presentation, the efficiencies that are expected to come from the economies of learning and specialisation, from having that dedicated body that just does this standard setting and review day in, day out. At the moment, the states and territories will opt to perform this process once a decade. So they're starting from scratch every time they start to engage with a national review process. That's if they volunteer to do it at all. So they've got to re-establish processes, expertise, consultants, different relationships, governance processes. All of those transaction costs are incurred every single time another state jurisdiction opts to lead a national process. You have it in the one dedicated body that becomes an expert at doing that day in, day out. That's its role, that's its purpose, that's its responsibility. And yes, you should see significant efficiencies as a result of that. So when new technologies come on the market that are going to improve animal welfare, improve industry productivity at the same time, I would imagine a national commission could look at that very quickly and put some guardrails and standards around it to facilitate adoption at a national level.
Thank you. We are very close to time now, so I'm going to end with one question for you, Jed, which kind of lead into the outro, I think, and that is like how the audience is asking, how do they help? What can they do next to try and promote the report and what it's telling us?
Yes, great segue, Bitter. If you would like to help advocate for these reforms at the federal level, then we'd certainly encourage you to sign up to the Fair Go for Animals campaign, because setting up a national commission is a core element of that campaign, and you'll be kept in the loop around different developments and updates, and also ways in which you can help. But don't wait for us to get in contact with you. Engage with your federal member of parliament right now to convey your support for a national commission, and look out for the link to the report and other resources that will come out following this webinar as well. Really excited to be sharing that with you, and working on this really important campaign for animals.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jed. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to everyone that joined us for your excellent questions. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but they were, really good questions. Feel free to email us if you have any more. But yeah, look out in your inboxes for further information about the report. And thank you so much for joining us. We will say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.